Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive into history's most fascinating train wrecks. Tonight, we're trading Roman sandals for Scottish kilts and swapping Latin battle cries for Gaelic war whoops as we explore the absolutely bonkers life of William Wallace, the man who looked at the most powerful military machine in medieval Europe and thought, you know what? I bet I could take them. Spoiler alert, it was complicated. So before we dive into this medieval comedy of errors, go ahead and hit that like button if you're ready for another journey through history's greatest. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Moments. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing our little community of history enthusiasts scattered across the globe, probably all wondering why they find other people's ancient mistakes so entertaining. Now, grab your favorite beverage, get comfortable, maybe light a candle for that cozy medieval atmosphere, and let's settle in for the tale of a man who turned, hold my ale and watch this, into a centuries-long legend. So, you think you understand the story of William Wallace? Sweet summer child. You've probably seen the movies, heard the speeches, maybe even visited the monument. But the real story, the actual historical mess behind the legend, that's where things get interesting. Because the truth about Wallace is somehow both more impressive and more ridiculous than anything Hollywood ever dreamed up. This is the story of a medieval Scottish landowner who accidentally became history's most famous freedom fighter, proving once and for all that sometimes the biggest historical impacts come from people who were just trying to mind their own business until someone made that absolutely impossible. Buckle up, because we're about to explore how one very tall, very stubborn man managed to annoy a king so thoroughly that he's still causing political arguments 7 centuries later. Picture this: Scotland, 2070 something. The year doesn't matter because nobody was keeping particularly good records, and frankly, everyone was too busy dying of preventable diseases to care about calendars. Into this world of mud sheep and questionable hygiene practices, a baby was born who would one day make King Edward I of England very, very annoyed. His name was William Wallace, though at birth he was probably just called the Screaming One, or hopefully this one survives past Tuesday. William grew up in Renfrewshire, which sounds fancy, but was actually just a collection of stone houses arranged around the radical concept of, let's not all freeze to death together. His father was a minor landowner, which in medieval terms meant he owned enough dirt to bury his enemies and enough sheep to make dinner interesting. The Wallace family wasn't rich, but they weren't peasants either. They occupied that awkward middle ground where you're too poor to avoid manual labour, but too wealthy to complain about it without sounding entitled. Young William was tall. Not just tall for the time period when most men topped out around 5 foot nothing and considered themselves giants, but actually, legitimately tall. 6.5 feet of Scottish determination wrapped in whatever fabric his mother could steal, borrow, or weave from sheep hair and wishful thinking. This height would prove both a blessing and a curse. Blessing because it made him an intimidating presence on any battlefield. Curse because medieval doorways were built by, and for people who apparently never expected anyone taller than a modern 12-year-old to use them. The boy received what passed for education in medieval Scotland, which meant he could probably write his name, count to numbers that required taking off his shoes, and had heard rumours about places beyond the next village. He spoke Norman French because that's what the fancy people spoke, Gaelic because that's what his grandmother spoke when she was cursing at the weather, and Latin because the church insisted everyone needed to know the language of a dead empire to properly communicate with an allegedly living god. But let's talk about the Scotland William inherited, because understanding this mess is crucial to understanding why a reasonably intelligent man would decide that picking a fight with England was a good life choice. Scotland in the late 13th century was having what historians politely call a succession crisis, which is academic speak for everyone with even a distant claim to the throne was sharpening their swords and practicing their I should be king speeches. When King Alexander Enetor died in 1286, he left behind a granddaughter, Margaret, who was all of 6 years old and living in Norway. The Scottish nobles looked at this situation and thought, perfect. A child ruler living in a foreign country? What could possibly go wrong? Everything went wrong. Margaret died on her way to Scotland, probably because medieval travel involved more ways to die than a modern horror movie. With no clear heir, Scotland suddenly had more potential kings than a Shakespeare play, and about as much political stability as a house of cards in a windstorm. Enter King Edward I of England, and known to his friends as Longshanks, and to everyone else as that bastard who keeps invading us. Edward had been asked to mediate the Scottish succession dispute, which was like asking a hungry wolf to guard your sheep while you went out for groceries. Edward agreed to help choose Scotland's next king, but only if whoever won agreed that Edward was their feudal overlord. The Scottish nobles, displaying the kind of political wisdom that would later give us reality television, agreed to this arrangement. Edward chose John Balliol as Scotland's king, probably because Balliol seemed like the type of man who would roll over and fetch newspapers if Edward asked nicely. Balliol was crowned in 1292, and for a brief moment, everyone pretended this arrangement might actually work. It didn't work. Balliol, it turned out, had just enough spine to occasionally disagree with Edward's more outrageous demands, which was exactly enough spine to thoroughly irritate the English king without being nearly enough spine to successfully resist him. By 1296, Edward had decided that subtle manipulation was taking too long and invaded Scotland with all the diplomatic finesse of a brick through a window. He captured Balliol, stripped him of his crown, and hauled him off to England like a particularly disappointing souvenir. The Scots, who had briefly enjoyed the illusion of independence, found themselves under direct English rule, which was about as popular as you'd expect. This is where our tall, ambitious, probably needs better life, insurance William Wallace enters the historical stage, though stage might be overstating it. It was more like stumbling onto a battlefield while trying to mind his own business. The exact details of what motivated Wallace to join the resistance are lost to history, buried under centuries of legend, propaganda, and Hollywood's aggressive relationship with historical accuracy. Some say English soldiers killed his father. Others claim they murdered his wife. Still others insist they burned his crops, stole his horse, or committed some other grievance that crossed the line from ordinary medieval oppression. This requires stabbing someone with a very large sword. What we know for certain is that by 1297, Wallace had decided that English rule was unacceptable, and that he, a minor landowner with no formal military training, was exactly the right person to do something about it. This was either breathtaking courage or spectacular stupidity, and honestly, in medieval warfare, the line between the two was thinner than a monk's patience during tax season. Wallace wasn't alone in his rebellion. Scotland was full of men who had reached their limit with English administration, though most of them expressed this frustration through grumbling, excessive drinking, and the occasional angry letter that they couldn't actually write. Wallace, however, decided that armed resistance was the way forward, which was the kind of decision that either makes you a national hero or gets you very dead very quickly. He partnered with Andrew Moray, a young nobleman who had escaped from English captivity and was running his own rebellion in northern Scotland. Moray was everything Wallace wasn't, formally educated in warfare, connected to Scotland's noble families, and possessed of the kind of strategic mind that understood battles were won through planning rather than enthusiasm alone. Together, they made an odd but effective team. Wallace brought the passion and the people. Moray brought the tactics and the credibility. Their first major success came at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September 1297, which was less a battle and more a masterclass in how terrain can make even the most overwhelming odds suddenly very manageable. The English army that approached Stirling was massive, professional, and commanded by John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, who had decades of military experience and absolutely no patience for Scottish nonsense. Surrey's force included heavy cavalry, professional infantry, and enough armour to outfit a small tank division. The Scottish army consisted largely of farmers, craftsmen, and men whose primary military experience involved arguing with sheep. Any reasonable military commander would have looked at this matchup and immediately begun composing surrender letters. Wallace and Moray, however, had noticed something important about the battlefield that Surrey's confidence had apparently overlooked. The English would have to cross a narrow bridge to reach the Scottish position, and bridges, as it turns out, are excellent places to turn military advantages into military disasters. The Abbey Craig, where the Scottish army waited, offered a perfect view of Stirling Bridge. Wallace and Moray could watch the English army approach, count their numbers, and plan accordingly. More importantly, they could wait for exactly the right moment to spring their trap, which required patience, timing, and the kind of nerve that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. Surrey, confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority, began crossing the bridge with his army. This was a process that took time, because medieval bridges weren't built for rapid military deployment. They were narrow, designed for merchants with carts and monks with donkeys, not for thousands of armed men trying to maintain formation while crossing running water. Wallace and Moray waited. They watched as the first wave of English soldiers crossed and began forming up on the Scottish side of the river. They waited as more men crossed, probably fighting every instinct that screamed at them to attack now, while they still had surprise on their side. They waited until roughly half the English army had crossed the bridge, creating a situation where Surrey's forces were split by an unfordable river with no way to quickly reunite. Then they attacked. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was over almost before it began. The English soldiers who had already crossed found themselves trapped between the Scottish army and the river, with no reinforcements able to reach them, and no retreat possible except back through their own advancing comrades. The narrow bridge became a bottleneck that turned Surrey's numerical advantage into a tactical nightmare. The English cavalry, usually the deciding factor in medieval battles, found themselves useless on terrain that didn't allow for proper charges. The infantry, separated from their support, were systematically destroyed by Scottish forces who had every advantage except the one that usually mattered most: numbers. Surrey, watching his army disintegrate from the south side of the bridge, probably experienced the kind of military humiliation that keeps generals awake at night for the rest of their lives. His massive, professional army had been outmaneuvered by a collection of Scottish farmers led by a man whose previous military experience consisted of whatever you learn from growing up tall and angry in medieval Scotland. The victory at Stirling Bridge transformed Wallace from a minor landowner with rebellion issues into Scotland's most famous military commander. Unfortunately, it also made him England's most wanted man, which in medieval terms meant that King Edward I had moved Wallace from the minor irritation category to the must be destroyed at all costs category. Andrew Moray was wounded during the battle and died shortly afterward, leaving Wallace as the sole leader of the Scottish resistance. This was problematic for several reasons, not least of which was that Wallace's greatest military success had been achieved through partnership with someone who actually knew what he was doing. Moray's death left Wallace without his most valuable strategic advisor and forced him to rely on his own military instincts, which, while impressive, weren't quite sufficient for the challenges ahead. Wallace was knighted and appointed Guardian of Scotland, titles that sounded magnificent but came with the slight drawback that Scotland was still mostly occupied by English forces, and Edward I was now personally invested in making Wallace's life as short and unpleasant as possible. The newly minted Guardian spent the winter of 1297-1298 trying to consolidate his victory, raise more troops, and convince Scotland's noble families that supporting his rebellion was a better long-term investment than accommodating English rule. This was a harder sell than you might think. Scottish nobles had a practical understanding of medieval politics that went something like, today's rebel hero is tomorrow's severed head on a spike, but land ownership tends to be more permanent than patriotic gestures. Many nobles who had initially supported Wallace began hedging their bets, which is a polite way of saying they started secretly negotiating with Edward while publicly maintaining their commitment to Scottish independence. This was standard medieval political practice, roughly equivalent to keeping your resume updated while assuring your current employer that you're absolutely committed to the company's vision. Wallace also had to deal with the practical challenges of maintaining an army without a functioning government to support it. Medieval armies required constant supplies of food, weapons and money, none of which were abundant in war-torn Scotland. English control of most major castles and towns meant that Wallace's forces were essentially camping out in the countryside, living off whatever they could forage, steal, or convince local farmers to donate to the cause of freedom. The winter was brutal, not just because Scottish winters are inherently hostile to human survival, but because maintaining morale among thousands of men who are cold, hungry, and starting to remember why they preferred farming to warfare is approximately as easy as teaching sheep to perform Shakespeare. Wallace managed to hold his army together through a combination of charisma, strategic brilliance, and the medieval equivalent of motivational speaking, which mostly involved reminding people that death in battle was preferable to life under foreign rule. Whether his troops found this argument convincing or simply lacked better options is lost to history. Meanwhile, Edward I was having the kind of winter that involves a lot of angry correspondence and strategic planning sessions that probably ended with someone getting thrown out of a window. The Battle of Stirling Bridge hadn't just been a military defeat, it had been a humiliation that damaged English prestige throughout Europe. Edward needed to restore his reputation, reassert English control over Scotland, and make it clear that rebellion against English rule was a temporary inconvenience, rather than a viable political strategy. Edward began assembling an army that would make his previous Scottish campaigns look like casual weekend outings. He recruited knights from across England and the continent, hired Welsh longbowmen who could put arrows through armour at distances that seemed physically impossible, and gathered enough supplies to support a campaign that would thoroughly demonstrate why rebelling against English rule was a poor life choice. The army Edward assembled for his 1298 Scottish campaign was massive even by medieval standards. Contemporary sources suggest it included over 25,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry, supported by artillery units and enough supplies to maintain extended operations. This wasn't just a military force, it was a statement of intent. Edward was coming to Scotland not just to defeat Wallace, but to permanently resolve the Scottish question through the application of overwhelming force. Wallace, aware that his small victory at Stirling Bridge had probably attracted more attention than was healthy, spent the spring of 1298 trying to prepare for what was obviously going to be the most important battle of his life. Unfortunately, preparing to fight the largest English army ever assembled in Scotland while hiding in forests and caves presented certain logistical challenges. His army was still primarily composed of common foot soldiers armed with long spears called schiltrons, which were effective against cavalry but vulnerable to archers and professional infantry. Wallace had few knights, limited cavalry, and almost no archers of his own. His strategic options were basically limited to finding terrain that would negate English advantages and hoping that patriotic enthusiasm could overcome professional military training. The two armies finally met at Falkirk in July 1298, and the battle that followed demonstrated exactly why medieval warfare usually favoured whoever had more money, better equipment, and professional soldiers. The Battle of Falkirk began promisingly for the Scots. Wallace had chosen his position carefully, placing his schiltrons on high ground with marshy terrain protecting their flanks. The English cavalry, led by nobles who had spent their entire lives training for exactly this kind of battle, charged the Scottish lines and discovered that long spears held by determined men are remarkably effective at discouraging horses from moving forward. For a brief moment, it looked like Wallace might repeat his success at Stirling Bridge. The English cavalry was stopped cold, unable to break the Scottish defensive formations. The schiltrons held their ground, presenting a wall of spear points that turned every cavalry charge into an expensive exercise in frustration. Then Edward's archers got involved. Welsh longbowmen, positioned where they could shoot into the Scottish formations without hitting their own cavalry, began systematically destroying Wallace's army from a distance. Medieval archery wasn't the romantic affair depicted in movies. It was industrial-scale killing, with hundreds of arrows falling into Scottish formations like deadly rain. The schiltrons, designed to resist cavalry charges, offered no protection against projectiles falling from above. Wallace's men began dying in numbers that made resistance impossible and retreat necessary. The disciplined formations that had stopped English cavalry dissolved as soldiers tried to escape the arrow storm. What had been an army became a mob, and what had been a battle became a rout. Wallace escaped Falkirk, but his reputation as an invincible military commander did not. The defeat demonstrated that patriotic enthusiasm, while inspiring, was not sufficient to overcome professional military organization supported by superior resources. More practically, it showed Scotland's nobles that Wallace's rebellion was probably not the winning investment they had hoped for. The defeat at Falkirk effectively ended Wallace's career as a military commander. He resigned his position as Guardian of Scotland and disappeared from the historical record for several years, probably because being Scotland's most wanted man, while no longer commanding an army, was the kind of career transition that required a very low profile. What Wallace did during these missing years is largely unknown, which has given historians, novelists, and screenwriters the opportunity to fill in the gaps with whatever narrative serves their purposes. Some claim he travelled to France seeking support for Scottish independence. Others suggest he went to Rome to plead Scotland's case before the Pope. Still others believe he simply went into hiding, living quietly while hoping Edward would eventually forget about him and move on to oppressing someone else. Edward I, however, was not the forgetting type. The king who had earned the nickname Hammer of the Scots was not about to let the man who had humiliated English arms at Stirling Bridge simply fade into comfortable obscurity. Edward wanted Wallace captured, tried, and executed as an example to anyone else who might consider rebellion a viable career path. The search for Wallace became something of a medieval manhunt, with English authorities offering rewards for information leading to his capture and making it clear that harbouring Scotland's most famous outlaw was the kind of decision that ended with your entire family decorating castle walls. Wallace's capture in 1305 came through betrayal, which was standard operating procedure for medieval political conflicts. Someone close to Wallace, motivated by English gold, Scottish politics, or simple self-preservation, provided information that led to his arrest near Glasgow. The identity of Wallace's betrayer remains disputed, partly because medieval record keeping was inconsistent, and partly because admitting to betraying Scotland's national hero wasn't the kind of thing people bragged about in later years. Wallace was taken to London for trial, which was less about determining guilt or innocence, and more about providing legal justification for what Edward had already decided would happen. Medieval trials for treason weren't designed to be fair, they were designed to be educational. The point wasn't justice, but demonstration. This is what happens to people who challenge royal authority. The charges against Wallace were comprehensive and creative. Treason, obviously, though this was complicated by the fact that Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward, and therefore couldn't technically betray him. Murder, which was true but beside the point in a war. Sacrilege, because some of Wallace's military campaigns had involved churches, and medieval law took religious property very seriously. Sedition, rebellion, and various other crimes that basically amounted to being Scottish while resisting English rule. Wallace's defence was straightforward. He had never been Edward's subject, and therefore couldn't be guilty of treason against him. This was legally sound, logically coherent, and completely irrelevant to the proceedings. Edward wasn't interested in legal technicalities. He was interested in making a point that would resonate throughout Scotland and beyond. The trial was held at Westminster Hall, which was chosen specifically for its capacity to accommodate the kind of audience Edward wanted for this particular performance. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, which Wallace probably understood, and followed legal procedures that had been carefully designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. Wallace was found guilty on all charges, which surprised absolutely no one who understood how medieval justice worked when kings had personal vendettas to settle. The sentence was death, but not the quick, clean death that nobles sometimes received when they lost political gambles. Wallace was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, which was the medieval legal system's way of saying, "We want to make sure this sends a very clear message." The execution took place on August 23, 1305, at Smithfield, which was London's traditional site for public executions and had seen enough death to qualify as historically significant. The event was designed as public entertainment and political education, combining the medieval love of spectacle with Edward's need to demonstrate the consequences of rebellion. Thousands of Londoners gathered to watch Wallace die, which tells you something important about medieval entertainment options. Public executions were social events, complete with vendors selling food and drink to spectators who treated judicial killing as a combination of theatre and moral instruction. Wallace faced his death with what contemporary accounts describe as remarkable courage, though it's worth noting that medieval chroniclers had a tendency to embellish details when they served narrative purposes. Whether Wallace actually delivered stirring final speeches or simply died with dignity is less important than what his death represented to different audiences. For Edward I, Wallace's execution was supposed to be the final chapter in the Scottish Rebellion, a definitive demonstration that resistance to English rule was futile. The elaborate brutality of the execution was intended to discourage future rebellions by making it clear that challenging royal authority carried consequences worse than death. For the Scots, Wallace's execution had exactly the opposite effect. Instead of discouraging rebellion, it created a martyr whose memory would inspire resistance for generations. Wallace's death transformed him from a failed military commander into a symbol of Scottish independence, which was probably not the outcome Edward had intended. The irony of Wallace's legacy is that his greatest impact on Scottish independence came after his death. The rebellion he had led was essentially over by 1305, with most Scottish nobles having made their peace with English rule. Wallace's execution, however, provided the emotional and symbolic foundation for future resistance movements, including Robert the Bruce's ultimately successful campaign for Scottish independence. Robert the Bruce, who had been playing both sides during Wallace's rebellion, was inspired by Wallace's death to commit fully to Scottish independence. Bruce's rebellion, beginning in 1306, would eventually succeed where Wallace's had failed, though it took decades of warfare and cost thousands of lives. The transformation of Wallace from historical figure to legendary hero began almost immediately after his death and has continued ever since. Medieval chroniclers embellished his story to serve their own political purposes. Later historians either celebrated him as a freedom fighter or dismissed him as a brigand, depending on their sympathies. Modern popular culture has created a Wallace who bears little resemblance to the historical figure, but serves contemporary ideas about heroism, patriotism, and resistance to oppression. The real William Wallace was neither the superhuman warrior of legend, nor the simple terrorist his enemies portrayed. He was a medieval landowner who found himself caught up in political events beyond his control, and chose to resist rather than accommodate. His military career lasted barely a year, ending in decisive defeat. His political leadership was brief and ultimately unsuccessful. His rebellion failed to achieve its immediate objectives and left Scotland under English rule. Yet Wallace's story resonates because it captures something essential about the human response to oppression. When faced with the choice between security and dignity, between survival and principle, Wallace chose to fight even when fighting meant almost certain death. Whether this was heroic or foolish depends on your perspective, but it was undeniably human. The historical Wallace was probably less charismatic than legend suggests, less strategically brilliant than his victory at Stirling Bridge might indicate, and less politically effective than Scottish nationalism requires. He was, however, genuinely committed to Scottish independence at a time when such commitment required extraordinary personal courage and carried devastating personal consequences. Wallace's legacy also demonstrates how historical figures become symbols that serve purposes their actual lives never intended. The medieval chroniclers who first recorded Wallace's story were more interested in political propaganda than historical accuracy. Renaissance historians who rediscovered Wallace used his story to explore themes of national identity and resistance to tyranny. Modern Scottish nationalism has embraced Wallace as a founding figure whose sacrifice established the moral foundation for Scottish independence. Each generation has recreated Wallace to serve its own needs, which means that the historical figure has become increasingly distant from the legendary hero who bears his name. This isn't unusual in the creation of national myths, but it does make understanding the actual Wallace increasingly difficult. What we can say with confidence is that William Wallace was a man who made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but led to consequences he probably didn't anticipate. He joined a rebellion that appeared to be succeeding, achieved a stunning military victory that made him famous throughout Europe, and then discovered that fame in medieval politics was often indistinguishable from having a very large target painted on your back. Wallace's story is ultimately about the gap between intention and outcome, between heroic gesture and practical result. He intended to free Scotland from English rule and died believing he had failed. In fact, his rebellion laid the groundwork for eventual Scottish independence, though he didn't live to see it, and probably wouldn't have recognised the Scotland that emerged from centuries of subsequent conflict. The Scotland Wallace fought for was a medieval kingdom with feudal obligations and dynastic complications. The Scotland that eventually achieved independence was a modern nation, state with different values, different institutions, and different relationships with its neighbours. Wallace couldn't have imagined the world his sacrifice helped create, which is both the tragedy and the triumph of his story. Modern Scotland remembers Wallace as a founding father of Scottish independence, which is historically accurate in the sense that his rebellion began the process that eventually led to Scottish freedom. It's historically questionable in the sense that Wallace's actual political goals, military strategies, and social vision were products of his medieval context and probably wouldn't translate well to modern circumstances. The Wallace Monument at Stirling, erected in the 19th century, represents this complex relationship between historical figure and national symbol. The monument celebrates Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge and his sacrifice for Scottish independence. But it was built by people who lived in a Scotland that Wallace wouldn't have recognised as the country he died trying to create. This disconnect between historical reality and symbolic meaning isn't unique to Wallace, but his story illustrates how national heroes are created through a process that has more to do with contemporary needs than historical facts. Every generation needs heroes who embody their values and justify their beliefs, and Wallace has proven remarkably adaptable to different historical moments and political requirements. The medieval chronicles that first recorded Wallace's story emphasized his military prowess and his defiance of tyranny, themes that resonated with audiences who lived under feudal authority and understood resistance primarily in military terms. Renaissance historians who rediscovered Wallace were more interested in his role as a defender of national independence, reflecting their own era's focus on emerging nation, states, and centralized monarchy. Enlightenment writers used Wallace's story to explore themes of natural rights and popular sovereignty, reading back into medieval history political concepts that wouldn't have made sense to Wallace himself. Romantic nationalists of the 19th century transformed Wallace into a symbol of authentic folk culture resisting foreign oppression, a role that served their own political projects of nation building and cultural revival. Modern popular culture has created a Wallace who combines elements from all these previous interpretations while adding contemporary ideas about individual heroism, democratic values, and resistance to authoritarianism. This Wallace is immediately recognizable to modern audiences, but probably would have been completely foreign to the historical figure who inspired the legend. The transformation of Wallace from medieval rebel to modern hero also reflects changing ideas about what makes someone historically significant. Medieval chroniclers valued Wallace primarily for his military achievements and his noble resistance to tyranny. Modern audiences are more interested in his supposed commitment to freedom, democracy, and national self-determination, concepts that didn't exist in recognizable form during Wallace's lifetime. This doesn't invalidate Wallace's legacy, but it does suggest that his continuing relevance has more to do with contemporary values than historical accuracy. Wallace matters to modern Scotland, not because of what he actually did in the 13th century, but because his story can be interpreted to support modern ideas about Scottish identity, political independence, and resistance to oppression. The historical Wallace was a product of his time, a medieval landowner who responded to political crisis according to the values and opportunities available to him. The legendary Wallace is a creation of later times, a symbol constructed to serve the political and cultural needs of people who lived in very different circumstances, but found inspiration in his story. Both versions of Wallace are real, in the sense that they have shaped historical events and influenced political decisions. the historical Wallace's rebellion contributed to the eventual establishment of Scottish independence. The legendary Wallace has inspired political movements, cultural revivals, and national identity formation for centuries after his death. Understanding Wallace requires holding both versions in mind simultaneously: the medieval rebel who made strategic decisions based on 13th century political realities, and the symbolic hero whose story has been continually reinterpreted to serve changing historical needs. Neither version alone captures the full significance of Wallace's impact on Scottish history and identity. The gap between historical figure and legendary hero also illustrates the broader challenge of understanding medieval history through modern perspectives. Medieval people lived in a world with different values, different institutions, and different assumptions about how society should function. Their decisions make sense within their historical context, but can seem strange or contradictory when judged by contemporary standards. Wallace's commitment to Scottish independence, for example, was probably motivated more by feudal loyalty and personal honour than by modern concepts of national self-determination. His military strategies reflected medieval assumptions about warfare, politics, and social organisation. His willingness to die, rather than submit to English rule, made sense within a culture that valued honour and loyalty above individual survival. Modern audiences often project contemporary political ideas onto Wallace's story, interpreting his rebellion as an early example of democratic resistance to authoritarianism. This interpretation isn't entirely wrong, but it risks missing the specifically medieval character of Wallace's choices and motivations. Wallace lived in a world where political authority was personal rather than institutional, where loyalty was owed to individuals rather than abstract principles, and where military action was often the only available means of political expression. His rebellion against English rule was simultaneously a defence of Scottish independence, an assertion of feudal rights, and a personal response to political humiliation. The complexity of Wallace's historical context doesn't diminish his significance, but it does suggest that understanding his legacy requires acknowledging the difference between what he meant to his contemporaries and what he has come to mean to later generations. Wallace matters both as a historical figure who influenced actual events and as a symbol that has served different political and cultural purposes across different historical periods. The continuing evolution of Wallace's legacy demonstrates how historical figures become cultural resources that each generation uses to understand its own challenges and opportunities. Wallace's story has been retold countless times, with each retelling emphasizing different aspects of his life and death to serve different contemporary purposes. Medieval chroniclers used Wallace's story to explore themes of loyalty, honour, and resistance to tyranny. Renaissance historians emphasized his role in the development of national sovereignty. Enlightenment writers focused on his defense of natural rights. Romantic nationalists celebrated his connection to authentic folk culture. Modern popular culture has transformed him into a symbol of individual heroism and democratic resistance. Each interpretation has captured something true about Wallace, while inevitably distorting other aspects of his story. The medieval chroniclers were right to emphasize his personal courage, but probably exaggerated his military genius. Renaissance historians correctly identified his importance to Scottish independence, but may have attributed to him political concepts he wouldn't have recognized. Modern popular culture accurately captures his symbolic significance, but often ignores the specifically medieval context that shaped his actual choices. The result is a Wallace who exists simultaneously as historical figure and cultural symbol, with different versions of his story serving different purposes for different audiences. This multiplicity isn't a problem to be solved, but a feature of how historical memory works in societies that value both factual accuracy and meaningful narrative. Wallace's execution in 1305 was intended to end his story, to demonstrate that rebellion against established authority would be punished with brutal finality. Instead, it began a process of symbolic transformation that has made Wallace more influential in death than he ever was in life. His martyrdom provided the emotional foundation for Scottish independence movements that continued long after his physical death had removed him from direct political involvement. The irony of Edward I's strategy is that the very brutality intended to discourage future rebellion helped create the symbol that would inspire it. Wallace's execution was designed to demonstrate English power and resolve, but it ultimately demonstrated the limits of military force in suppressing political ideas. You can kill a rebel, but killing a rebel often creates a martyr, and martyrs are much harder to defeat than living opponents. Wallace's transformation from failed rebel to national hero also illustrates how political symbols develop their own momentum independent of historical facts. The legendary Wallace has influenced Scottish politics for centuries, inspiring movements and justifying decisions that the historical Wallace never could have anticipated. This symbolic Wallace has become a political force in his own right, with real consequences for actual people and events. The continuing relevance of Wallace's story suggests that certain human experiences transcend their specific historical contexts. The choice between security and principle, between accommodation and resistance, between individual survival and collective loyalty, remains meaningful across different historical periods and cultural contexts. Wallace's specific situation was uniquely medieval, but the fundamental dilemma he faced continues to resonate with modern audiences. This doesn't mean that Wallace's story provides simple lessons for contemporary politics, but it does suggest why his legacy has proven so durable and adaptable. Every generation faces questions about when resistance to authority is justified, how individuals should respond to collective oppression, and what sacrifices are worthwhile for political principles. Wallace's story offers one example of how someone answered these questions, even if his specific answers reflected his particular historical circumstances. The historical William Wallace was a medieval landowner who made political and military decisions based on 13th century Scottish conditions. The legendary William Wallace is a symbol of resistance to oppression that has inspired political movements across different historical periods and cultural contexts. Both versions of Wallace are historically significant, but they serve different purposes and require different kinds of understanding. Wallace's actual rebellion lasted barely a year and ended in military defeat. His symbolic rebellion has continued for over 7 centuries and has influenced countless political movements, cultural revivals, and national identity projects. The historical Wallace failed to achieve Scottish independence. The legendary Wallace helped create the cultural foundation that made Scottish independence possible. Understanding Wallace requires recognizing both the historical figure and the symbol, acknowledging their differences while appreciating their connections. The historical Wallace provides insight into medieval politics, military strategy, and social organization. The legendary Wallace illuminates how societies create and use political symbols to understand their own challenges and possibilities. Wallace's story ultimately demonstrates both the power and the limitations of individual action in historical change. One person's decisions can have consequences that extend far beyond their lifetime, but those consequences often take forms that the original actor never intended or anticipated. Wallace chose to resist English rule and died believing he had failed. His failure, however, created the conditions for eventual success, though that success came in forms he couldn't have imagined. The gap between intention and outcome in Wallace's story reflects broader patterns in historical change. Individuals make decisions based on their immediate circumstances and limited information, but these decisions interact with larger forces and processes to create results that no one fully controls or predicts. Wallace's rebellion was simultaneously a personal response to political oppression and a contribution to historical processes that extended far beyond his individual life and death. This perspective doesn't diminish Wallace's courage or significance, but it does suggest that understanding his impact requires looking beyond his personal story to examine how individual actions connect with broader historical patterns. Wallace mattered not just because of what he did, but because of how what he did intersected with larger forces of political change, cultural development, and social transformation. The historical record of Wallace's life is fragmentary and contested, reflecting both the limitations of medieval documentation and the political interests that have shaped how his story has been preserved and transmitted. What we know about Wallace comes primarily from sources with clear political agendas, whether medieval chroniclers seeking to justify or condemn his rebellion, or later historians using his story to support their own political projects. This doesn't mean that we can't know anything reliable about Wallace, but it does mean that separating historical fact from political interpretation requires careful analysis of sources that were never intended to provide objective historical documentation. Medieval chroniclers were primarily concerned with moral and political instruction rather than factual accuracy, and their accounts of Wallace reflect these priorities. Later historians have often been more interested in what Wallace's story can teach about their own times than in understanding Wallace within his original historical context. This has produced a rich tradition of Wallace scholarship that tells us as much about the historians and their periods as it does about Wallace himself. The result is a historical record that provides genuine insight into Wallace's life and times, while simultaneously demonstrating how historical figures become cultural symbols that serve purposes beyond their original historical significance. Wallace exists both as a specific individual who made particular choices in particular circumstances, and as a representative figure whose story illuminates broader themes about resistance, loyalty, and political change. Wallace's continuing relevance to Scottish identity and politics demonstrates how historical figures can transcend their original contexts to become resources for understanding contemporary challenges. His story provides a framework for thinking about questions of political loyalty, individual conscience, and collective resistance that remain relevant centuries after his death. At the same time, the distance between the historical Wallace and his legendary counterpart illustrates the dangers of using historical figures primarily as symbols rather than as subjects of historical understanding. When Wallace becomes simply a symbol of Scottish resistance, we risk losing sight of the specifically medieval character of his choices and the particular historical circumstances that shaped his rebellion. The challenge of understanding Wallace is to appreciate both his historical significance and his symbolic power while recognizing the differences between them. This requires acknowledging that the historical Wallace was a product of his time, whose decisions reflected medieval values and circumstances, while also recognizing that his story has continued to provide meaning and inspiration for people facing very different challenges in very different times. The Scotland that Wallace died trying to defend was fundamentally different from the Scotland that eventually emerged from centuries of political struggle. Medieval Scotland was a feudal kingdom with a warrior aristocracy, a subsistence agricultural economy, and political institutions based on personal loyalty rather than democratic representation. The Scottish independence that Wallace fought for would have maintained these medieval characteristics, while simply replacing English overlordship with Scottish sovereignty. The modern Scotland that claims Wallace as a founding father is a democratic society with industrial economy, representative political institutions, and social values that would have been incomprehensible to a 13th century landowner. The independence that contemporary Scottish nationalists seek is based on principles of popular sovereignty, economic self-determination, and cultural autonomy that didn't exist in Wallace's conceptual vocabulary. This transformation illustrates how political symbols evolve to serve changing historical needs, while maintaining emotional connections to their original sources. Wallace represents Scottish resistance to foreign domination, but the meaning of both Scottish and resistance has changed dramatically since his death. Each generation has redefined these concepts while maintaining Wallace as their symbolic embodiment. The process by which Wallace became a Scottish national hero also demonstrates how historical memory is constructed through selective emphasis and creative interpretation. The aspects of Wallace's story that support modern Scottish nationalism have been highlighted and embellished, while elements that complicate contemporary political narratives have been downplayed or ignored. Wallace's defeat at Falkirk, for example, receives less attention in popular Scottish memory than his victory at Stirling Bridge, even though the defeat was more representative of his overall military record. His resignation as Guardian of Scotland after Falkirk is often overlooked entirely, despite its importance for understanding his actual political leadership. His years in hiding before his capture are either ignored or filled with romantic speculation that serves narrative purposes rather than historical accuracy. This selective memory isn't necessarily problematic, but it does highlight the difference between historical understanding and political symbolism. National heroes serve different functions and historical figures, and expecting them to be identical creates confusion about both history and politics. Wallace's symbolic significance to Scottish nationalism has also influenced how his story is told in other contexts. English historians have often portrayed Wallace as a brigand or terrorist, emphasizing his violations of feudal law and his attacks on civilian targets. This portrayal serves English political narratives about legitimate authority and unlawful rebellion, but it's no more historically objective than Scottish heroic narratives. American popular culture has embraced Wallace as a symbol of resistance to tyranny and individual heroism, themes that resonate with American political mythology regardless of their historical accuracy. Hollywood's version of Wallace combines Scottish nationalism with American individualism to create a character who serves contemporary entertainment purposes while bearing little resemblance to the medieval original. Each of these interpretations captures some aspect of Wallace's historical significance, while inevitably distorting others. The Scottish nationalist version correctly emphasizes his commitment to independence, but may exaggerate his military genius and political effectiveness. The English establishment version accurately notes his violation of feudal law, but ignores the legitimate grievances that motivated his rebellion. The American popular culture version captures his individual courage, but misses the collective and medieval character of his political vision. The multiplicity of Wallace interpretations reflects the broader challenge of understanding historical figures who become political symbols. Once someone enters the realm of national mythology, their historical reality becomes entangled with contemporary political needs in ways that make objective assessment increasingly difficult. This doesn't mean that historical truth is irrelevant or that all interpretations of Wallace are equally valid. Historical evidence provides genuine constraints on what we can reasonably claim about Wallace's life, motivations, and significance. The problem isn't that we can't know anything reliable about Wallace, but that what we know is often overshadowed by what different groups want him to represent. The historical Wallace was brave but not superhuman, committed but not infallible, successful but not ultimately victorious. He made choices that reflected his medieval context and achieved results that influenced, but didn't determine the eventual course of Scottish history. Understanding him requires acknowledging both his genuine historical significance and the limitations of individual action in complex political situations. Wallace's rebellion succeeded in demonstrating that English rule in Scotland could be challenged and that Scottish resistance could achieve tactical victories against overwhelming odds. These demonstrations were historically important because they established precedents for future resistance movements and maintained the possibility of Scottish independence during a period when it seemed practically impossible. At the same time, Wallace's rebellion failed to achieve its immediate objectives and left Scotland under English rule with enhanced security measures designed to prevent future uprisings. The practical result of Wallace's resistance was increased English control over Scottish political institutions and more systematic suppression of Scottish autonomy. This mixed legacy reflects the complex relationship between immediate political action and long-term historical change. Wallace's rebellion was simultaneously a failure in its immediate context and a success in its longer-term consequences, though the success came in forms that Wallace himself never lived to see or influence. The transformation of Wallace from failed rebel to successful symbol took generations to complete and required the contributions of many people who built on his example while adapting it to their own circumstances. Robert the Bruce's successful campaign for Scottish independence drew inspiration from Wallace's sacrifice while learning from his strategic mistakes. Later Scottish resistance movements invoked Wallace's memory while developing political strategies that reflected their own historical situations. Modern Scottish nationalism has claimed Wallace as a founding figure while pursuing independence through democratic political processes that would have been meaningless to a medieval warrior. This continuity of symbolic inspiration, combined with practical adaptation, demonstrates how political movements use historical memory to maintain identity and purpose across changing circumstances. Wallace's story has also become part of broader international narratives about resistance to oppression. and the struggle for national self-determination. His rebellion against English rule has been interpreted as an early example of anti-colonial resistance, though this interpretation requires projecting modern political concepts onto medieval feudal relationships. The comparison between Wallace's rebellion and modern independence movements illuminates both similarities and differences in how political resistance operates across different historical periods. Like modern independence leaders, Wallace articulated a vision of political autonomy that inspired followers to accept significant personal risks for collective goals. Unlike modern independence movements, Wallace's rebellion was conducted entirely through military means within a political system that offered no peaceful alternatives for political change. The absence of democratic political institutions in medieval Scotland meant that resistance to unwanted political authority necessarily took military form. Wallace couldn't vote against English rule, organise peaceful protests, or appeal to international opinion. His only options were submission or armed rebellion, and he chose rebellion despite understanding its likely personal consequences. Modern independence movements operate in political contexts that offer multiple strategies for pursuing political change, from electoral politics to international diplomacy to economic pressure. These alternatives don't necessarily make modern resistance easier or more successful, but they do change the calculus of political action in ways that make direct comparison with Wallace's situation problematic. Wallace's willingness to die for Scottish independence was remarkable partly because it was freely chosen despite the availability of alternatives. I would probably have been content to allow Wallace to submit and live quietly under English rule. Wallace chose death over accommodation, which was either heroic conviction or spectacular stubbornness, depending on your perspective. This choice has resonated across centuries because it dramatizes the tension between practical survival and principled resistance that individuals and groups continue to face in different forms. While few people today face the specific choice between death and political submission that confronted Wallace, many people face analogous choices between security and principle, between accommodation and resistance, between individual welfare and collective loyalty. Wallace's story provides one example of how someone resolved these tensions. Though his resolution reflected his particular circumstances and shouldn't be treated as a universal model for political behavior, his choice to resist rather than accommodate was appropriate for his situation, but might not be appropriate for different circumstances or different individuals. The enduring appeal of Wallace's story lies partly in its dramatic simplicity: one man choosing principle over survival, collective loyalty over individual welfare, uncertain resistance over certain accommodation. This simplicity is both the strength and the limitation of Wallace as a political symbol. It provides clear moral inspiration, but doesn't offer much guidance for the complex strategic decisions that actual political resistance requires. Real political resistance involves countless small decisions about strategy, timing, allies, and tactics that don't lend themselves to heroic narrative, but determine whether resistance movements succeed or fail. Wallace's story emphasizes the moment of dramatic choice, while largely ignoring the practical challenges of sustaining political resistance over time. This emphasis on dramatic individual choice reflects broader patterns in how societies remember and use historical examples. Heroic narratives are more emotionally compelling and easier to remember than complex strategic analysis, which makes them effective tools for political inspiration but poor guides for political strategy. Wallace's legacy demonstrates both the power and the limitations of heroic narrative in political memory. His story has inspired countless people to resist oppression and pursue political change, but it hasn't provided much practical guidance for how to conduct effective resistance movements. The inspiration is valuable, but it needs to be supplemented with more complex understanding of how political change actually occurs. The historical Wallace made strategic decisions based on his understanding of medieval political and military realities. Some of these decisions were brilliant, like his tactical plan for the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Others were problematic, like his failure to develop sustainable political institutions that could survive military defeat. His overall strategic vision was coherent within his historical context, but wouldn't translate directly to contemporary circumstances. Understanding Wallace's strategic thinking requires reconstructing the political and military realities of late 13th century Scotland, which were fundamentally different from contemporary conditions. Medieval warfare, feudal politics, and aristocratic culture created opportunities and constraints that shaped Wallace's choices in ways that modern audiences often don't fully appreciate. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge, for example, was possible partly because medieval military communication was slow and unreliable, allowing him to achieve tactical surprise against a larger, better equipped army. His defeat at Falkirk reflected both the limitations of his strategic resources and the effectiveness of English military innovations, particularly the combination of heavy cavalry with Welsh longbowmen. These tactical details matter for understanding Wallace's actual historical significance, which was based on his ability to achieve military success within the constraints of medieval warfare rather than on his embodiment of timeless political principles. Wallace was effective as a medieval military commander dealing with medieval political problems, and his legacy should be understood within that context. The transformation of Wallace from medieval commander to modern symbol has inevitably obscured some aspects of his historical significance while highlighting others. The symbolic Wallace represents timeless values of courage and resistance, but the historical Wallace demonstrated specifically medieval forms of political and military leadership that reflected his particular time and place. Both versions of Wallace are historically important, but they serve different purposes and require different kinds of appreciation. The symbolic Wallace inspires contemporary political action and cultural identity formation. The historical Wallace provides insight into medieval society, politics, and warfare. Neither version alone captures the full significance of Wallace's impact on Scottish history and identity. The continuing evolution of Wallace's legacy also demonstrates how historical figures become resources for ongoing political and cultural projects that extend far beyond their original historical significance. Wallace's story has been used to support Scottish nationalism, British unionism, American individualism, and various other political projects that he never could have anticipated. This adaptability is both a strength and a weakness of Wallace as a historical symbol. His story can inspire diverse political movements and cultural projects, but its very flexibility makes it difficult to use for specific political guidance. Wallace can be invoked to support almost any form of resistance to almost any form of authority, which makes his symbol powerful but not particularly precise. The precision comes from understanding Wallace within his specific historical context, while appreciating how his story has been adapted to serve different contemporary purposes. This requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously: Wallace as medieval rebel, as Scottish national hero, as symbol of resistance to oppression, and as cultural resource for ongoing political projects. Each perspective illuminates different aspects of Wallace's significance, while inevitably obscuring others. The medieval rebel perspective emphasizes his feudal loyalties and tactical innovations. The national hero perspective highlights his contribution to Scottish independence. The resistance symbol perspective focuses on his moral courage and principled defiance. The cultural resource perspective examines how his story has been used for various political and artistic projects. None of these perspectives alone captures the full meaning of Wallace's historical legacy, but together they provide a more complete understanding of how one individual's choices can influence historical development across multiple generations and cultural contexts. Wallace's execution was intended to end his political influence, but instead it began a process of symbolic transformation that has made him more politically significant in death than he was in life. This transformation demonstrates how political symbols develop their own historical momentum, influencing events and decisions long after the original political context that created them has disappeared. The irony of Wallace's legacy is that his greatest historical impact came through his failure rather than his success. His military victories were tactically impressive, but strategically limited. His political leadership was brief and ended in defeat. His death, however, provided the emotional and symbolic foundation for Scottish independence movements that continued for centuries and eventually achieved the goals that Wallace himself never lived to see accomplished. This pattern of symbolic success emerging from practical failure is common in the creation of political martyrs and national heroes. The immediate practical consequences of heroic action are often disappointing, but the symbolic consequences can be transformative. Wallace's story illustrates how individual sacrifice can create cultural resources that later movements use for political projects that extend far beyond the original actor's vision or intention. The historical significance of Wallace's rebellion extends beyond its immediate military and political consequences to include its role in establishing precedents for resistance and maintaining the possibility of Scottish independence during a period when it seemed practically impossible. These precedents and possibilities were crucial for later independence movements, even though they took forms that Wallace never anticipated. Wallace's rebellion demonstrated that English rule in Scotland could be challenged successfully, at least temporarily. This demonstration was important, not because it achieved lasting political change, but because it established that such change was possible under the right circumstances. Future resistance movements could point to Wallace's example as evidence that Scottish independence was achievable, even when it seemed unlikely. The symbolic power of Wallace's sacrifice also provided emotional justification for the costs and risks of continued resistance. Independence movements require participants to accept significant personal sacrifices for uncertain collective benefits, and Wallace's example demonstrated that such sacrifices could be worthwhile even when they didn't produce immediate success. This symbolic function of Wallace's legacy was probably more important for Scottish independence than his actual military and political achievements, though the symbolic significance depended on the historical reality of his resistance and sacrifice. Wallace became a powerful symbol precisely because he had actually resisted English rule and actually died for Scottish independence, rather than simply talking about these principles. The authenticity of Wallace's sacrifice was crucial for his symbolic effectiveness, which suggests that political symbols derive their power partly from their connection to genuine historical events rather than from pure imagination or propaganda. Wallace's story works as inspiration because it represents real choices made by a real person facing real consequences, not just fictional heroism designed to serve political purposes. At the same time, the symbolic Wallace has been constructed through selective emphasis and creative interpretation that often departs significantly from historical accuracy. The power of Wallace's symbol comes partly from its connection to historical reality, but also from its adaptation to serve contemporary political and cultural needs. This tension between historical authenticity and symbolic utility is characteristic of how national heroes function in political memory. They need to be historically real enough to provide authentic inspiration, but symbolically flexible enough to serve changing political requirements. Wallace has proven remarkably effective at serving both functions, though often for different audiences and purposes. The continuing debate over Wallace's historical significance reflects broader questions about how societies should remember and use their past. Should historical figures be understood primarily within their original contexts, or should they be interpreted in ways that serve contemporary needs? Should historical accuracy take precedence over symbolic meaning, or should political inspiration be valued more highly than scholarly precision? Wallace's legacy suggests that these questions don't require either or answers. Historical understanding and symbolic meaning can coexist if we're clear about which function we're emphasizing in different contexts. Wallace can be simultaneously appreciated as a medieval rebel whose choices reflected his particular circumstances, and as a symbol of resistance whose story provides inspiration for contemporary political action. The key is maintaining awareness of the difference between these functions and not confusing historical analysis with political symbolism. When we study Wallace as a historical figure, we should focus on understanding his choices within their medieval context. When we invoke Wallace as a political symbol, we should acknowledge that we're using his story for purposes that extend beyond his original historical significance. This distinction allows us to appreciate both the historical Wallace and the symbolic Wallace without requiring them to be identical. The historical figure provides insight into medieval politics and society. The symbolic figure provides resources for contemporary political and cultural projects. Both are valuable, but they serve different purposes and require different kinds of understanding. Wallace's story ultimately demonstrates the complex relationship between individual choice and historical change. One person's decisions can have consequences that extend far beyond their lifetime, but those consequences often take unexpected forms and serve purposes that the original actor never intended. Wallace chose to resist English rule and died believing he had failed, but his failure created conditions for eventual success that he couldn't have anticipated. This pattern suggests both the power and the limitations of individual action in historical change. Individuals can influence historical development through their choices and actions, but they cannot control how their influence will be interpreted and used by later generations. Wallace's rebellion mattered historically, but not necessarily in the ways he intended or expected. The gap between intention and historical impact in Wallace's story reflects broader patterns in how social and political change occurs. Historical development results from the interaction of countless individual decisions with larger social, economic, and political processes that no one person fully controls or understands. Wallace's choices influenced these processes, but the ultimate outcomes were shaped by forces and events that extended far beyond his individual agency. Understanding Wallace's historical significance requires appreciating both his genuine impact on Scottish political development and the limitations of what any individual could accomplish within the constraints of medieval politics and society. Wallace mattered, but he mattered as one factor among many in complex historical processes, rather than as the sole determinant of Scottish political destiny. This perspective doesn't diminish Wallace's courage or historical importance, but it does provide a more realistic understanding of how individual action relates to historical change. Wallace's rebellion was historically significant because it contributed to longer-term processes of Scottish political development, not because it single-handedly determined the course of Scottish history. The historical record suggests that Wallace understood the limitations of his position and the likely consequences of his choices. His decision to continue fighting despite overwhelming odds was made with full awareness that he was probably choosing martyrdom over victory. This makes his choice more rather than less impressive, because it demonstrates commitment to principle despite realistic assessment of probable outcomes. Wallace's willingness to accept personal destruction for political principle has resonated across centuries because it represents a form of moral courage that transcends specific historical circumstances. While the particular political situation that confronted Wallace was uniquely medieval, the choice between principle and survival remains relevant across different historical periods and cultural contexts. This universal relevance of Wallace's fundamental choice helps explain why his story has proven so adaptable to different political and cultural projects. The specific details of his rebellion reflect his medieval context, but the underlying moral drama speaks to concerns that extend beyond any particular historical period. Wallace's legacy demonstrates how individual moral choices can achieve historical significance that extends far beyond their immediate practical consequences. His rebellion failed militarily and politically, but his willingness to die for Scottish independence created a symbol that influenced Scottish political development for centuries. This transformation of practical failure into symbolic success illustrates one way that individual action can influence historical change, even when it doesn't achieve its immediate objectives. Wallace's choices mattered historically not because they produced immediate political results, but because they created cultural resources that later movements used for their own political projects. The process by which Wallace's practical failure became symbolic success also demonstrates how historical memory is constructed through the interaction of actual events with later interpretation and political use. Wallace's story has been continually retold and reinterpreted to serve changing historical needs while maintaining connection to the original events that gave it authenticity and emotional power. This ongoing process of reinterpretation ensures that Wallace's legacy will continue to evolve as Scottish society faces new challenges and opportunities. Future generations will probably create new versions of Wallace's story that serve their particular needs while maintaining connection to the historical figure who inspired the original legend. The continuing vitality of Wallace's legacy demonstrates both the power of authentic historical example and the creative capacity of political memory. Wallace's story works as inspiration because it represents genuine courage and commitment, but it remains relevant because each generation finds new meanings in his example that serve their own political and cultural projects. Understanding Wallace requires appreciating both the historical authenticity that gives his story power and the creative interpretation that maintains its relevance. The historical Wallace provides the foundation, but the symbolic Wallace is constructed through ongoing cultural work that adapts his example to serve changing historical needs. This dual character of Wallace's legacy, combining historical authenticity with symbolic flexibility, illustrates how societies maintain connection with their past while adapting to changing circumstances. Wallace's story provides continuity with Scottish political tradition while remaining adaptable to contemporary political requirements. The result is a legacy that serves both historical understanding and political inspiration, though these functions require different kinds of appreciation and shouldn't be confused with each other. Wallace's historical significance and his symbolic power are both real and important, but they operate according to different logics and serve different purposes. Wallace's execution in London was intended to demonstrate English power and resolve, but it ultimately demonstrated the limitations of military force in suppressing political ideas and cultural identity. Edward I could kill Wallace, but he couldn't kill what Wallace represented to Scottish political imagination. The failure of Edward's strategy illustrates a broader pattern in political conflict. Military victory doesn't necessarily translate into political success, especially when resistance is motivated by deep-seated grievances and cultural identity rather than simple political ambition. Wallace's rebellion was rooted in Scottish rejection of English rule that extended beyond any individual leader's influence. Edward's inability to pacify Scotland through Wallace's execution forced him to pursue more systematic policies of political control and cultural suppression. But these policies often generated new forms of resistance rather than eliminating Scottish opposition to English rule. The cycle of resistance and repression that began with Wallace's rebellion continued long after his death. This pattern suggests that Wallace's rebellion was less the cause of Anglo-Scottish conflict than a symptom of deeper political and cultural tensions that couldn't be resolved through military means alone. Wallace's resistance reflected Scottish rejection of English rule that would have found other expressions even if he had never existed. At the same time, Wallace's rebellion gave these broader tensions specific focus and symbolic representation that influenced how later conflicts developed. His example provided a model for resistance that later movements could emulate and adapt, even when their specific circumstances were different from his. The interaction between Wallace's individual choices and broader historical processes demonstrates how personal agency and structural forces combine to shape historical development. Wallace couldn't single-handedly determine the course of Anglo-Scottish relations, but his choices influenced how these relations developed by providing precedents, symbols, and emotional resources for later political action. Wallace's historical significance lies in this intersection of individual agency with larger historical processes. He mattered because his choices resonated with broader Scottish political aspirations and provided focus for resistance movements that extended far beyond his personal influence. His legacy demonstrates how individual action can achieve historical importance through its interaction with collective forces and cultural developments. The transformation of Wallace from historical figure to political symbol also illustrates how societies create and maintain collective memory through selective emphasis and creative interpretation. Wallace's story has been continually retold in ways that highlight aspects relevant to contemporary concerns while downplaying elements that complicate current political narratives. This process of selective memory isn't necessarily problematic, but it does highlight the difference between historical scholarship and political symbolism. Academic historians aim to understand Wallace within his original context, while political movements use his story to serve contemporary purposes. Both functions are legitimate, but they shouldn't be confused with each other. The scholarly study of Wallace focuses on understanding his choices within the constraints and opportunities of medieval Scottish politics. This requires careful analysis of limited and often biased historical sources to reconstruct the political, military, and social context that shaped his rebellion. The goal is historical understanding rather than contemporary political application. Political use of Wallace's legacy focuses on extracting inspiration and guidance from his story for contemporary challenges. This requires interpreting his example in ways that speak to current concerns, even when such interpretation requires significant creative adaptation of historical details. The goal is political effectiveness rather than historical accuracy. Both approaches to Wallace's legacy serve important functions, but they operate according to different standards and shouldn't be evaluated by the same criteria. Historical scholarship should be judged by its accuracy and insight into medieval conditions. Political symbolism should be judged by its effectiveness in inspiring and guiding contemporary action. The confusion between these functions often generates unnecessary controversy about Wallace's legacy. Historians who point out inaccuracies in popular portrayals of Wallace are sometimes accused of undermining Scottish nationalism. Political movements that use Wallace's story for contemporary purposes are sometimes criticised for historical irresponsibility. Both criticisms miss the point that historical scholarship and political symbolism serve different legitimate functions. Wallace's legacy is rich enough to support both scholarly analysis and political inspiration without requiring them to be identical. The historical Wallace provides fascinating insight into medieval society and politics. The symbolic Wallace provides powerful inspiration for contemporary political and cultural projects. Both are valuable contributions to Scottish culture and identity. The key to understanding Wallace's legacy is recognizing that it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. As a historical figure, Wallace illuminates the political, military, and social dynamics of medieval Scotland. As a political symbol, he represents values and aspirations that transcend his specific historical context. As a cultural resource, he provides material for ongoing artistic and political projects that serve contemporary needs. Each level of Wallace's legacy has its own logic and serves its own purposes. The historical level requires careful attention to evidence and context. The symbolic level requires creative interpretation that connects past example with present needs. The cultural level requires ongoing adaptation that maintains relevance while preserving connection to the original source. Wallace's continuing significance demonstrates how historical figures can transcend their original contexts to become permanent resources for human reflection on questions of courage, loyalty, and political resistance. His story provides one example of how someone faced the choice between security and principle, but it's an example that has proven remarkably durable and adaptable across changing historical circumstances. The durability of Wallace's legacy suggests that his story captures something essential about human responses to political oppression that remains relevant across different historical periods and cultural contexts. While the specific circumstances of his rebellion were uniquely medieval, the fundamental choice he faced between accommodation and resistance continues to confront individuals and groups in different forms. Wallace's example doesn't provide simple answers to contemporary political questions, but it does illustrate how courage and principle can influence historical development even when they don't produce immediate practical success. His legacy demonstrates that political action can be worthwhile for reasons that extend beyond its immediate consequences, and that individual choice can matter historically even when it doesn't determine specific outcomes. This understanding of Wallace's significance emphasizes both the importance and the limitations of heroic individual action in political change. Wallace's rebellion mattered historically, but it mattered as part of larger processes of political and cultural development rather than as an isolated example of individual heroism. The historical William Wallace was a medieval Scottish landowner who chose to resist English rule despite understanding the likely personal consequences of that choice. His rebellion achieved some tactical successes, but ultimately failed to accomplish its immediate political objectives. His execution was intended to end his political influence, but instead began his transformation into a symbol that has influenced Scottish politics and culture for over 7 centuries. This transformation from failed rebel to successful symbol demonstrates how historical significance can develop in ways that original actors never anticipated or intended. Wallace's story has become a permanent part of Scottish political and cultural identity, providing inspiration and guidance for movements and projects that he never could have imagined. The continuing evolution of Wallace's legacy ensures that his story will remain relevant as Scottish society faces new challenges and opportunities. Future generations will probably create new interpretations of Wallace's example that serve their particular needs while maintaining connection to the historical figure who inspired the original legend. Wallace's legacy ultimately demonstrates the complex relationship between individual choice and historical change, between immediate consequences and long-term significance, between historical accuracy and political inspiration. His story provides insight into all these relationships while remaining adaptable to serve ongoing political and cultural projects. Understanding Wallace requires appreciating both his specific historical circumstances and his continuing symbolic relevance, both his medieval context and his modern adaptations, both his practical failures and his symbolic successes. This complex understanding reflects the complex reality of how individual action influences historical development and how historical memory serves contemporary purposes. William Wallace died believing he had failed to achieve Scottish independence. In a sense, he was right. His rebellion ended in military defeat, and his execution demonstrated English power over Scottish resistance. In another sense, he was profoundly wrong. His sacrifice provided the foundation for Scottish independence movements that eventually achieved goals he never lived to see accomplished. This gap between immediate failure and long-term success captures something essential about political action and historical change. The consequences of our choices often extend far beyond what we can anticipate or control, influencing historical development in ways that become clear only across generations and centuries. Wallace's story suggests that political action can be worthwhile even when its immediate consequences are disappointing, because individual choices contribute to historical processes that extend far beyond any single person's influence or understanding. His legacy demonstrates both the power and the mystery of how human choice influences historical change across time.